Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we will complete part 2 of the story narrated in 2 Kings 5. This is the story that features Naaman, a Syrian military officer, an Israelite girl who had been abducted and subsequently enslaved by Naaman's household, and Elisha, the Israelite prophet. At the conclusion of our treatment last time, Naaman was so thankful that he got rid of his terrible skin condition by washing in the Jordan River that he offered a lavish gift to Elisha. But the prophet was not interested. He apparently wanted to avoid any hint that a miracle like this could be bought. Once Naaman's gift was refused, he asked for a present for himself that he could bring back to Syria. The present was odd, to say the least. Israelite dirt. The amount that 2 mules could haul. That's the amount he wanted. Why did Naaman want dirt? Because he wanted to use the dirt to construct a place where he could make offerings to the Israelite God. Naaman's logic was simple. Evidently, he figured that an offering to the Israelite deity required Israelite soil. He would use that soil for these offerings. That's in verse 17. From now on, only the Israelite God would be the recipient of Naaman's offerings. He had no intention of making sacrifices to any other god. He had all the zeal of a new convert. Indicating how seriously Naaman took his new religious commitment, he also asked Elisha for forgiveness in advance. He informed the Israelite prophet of a duty he had to perform back in Syria that he did not want to be misconstrued. It was part of his job to usher the Syrian king into the house of Rimmon, another name for the Syrian god Hadad. Of course, protocol would be broken were anyone accompanying the king appearing to be taller. Since Naaman was taller than the king, it was necessary for him to bow low so that he would not embarrass the shorter king. Of course, when he lowered himself, this could be seen as genuflecting to the Syrian god. Naaman wanted Elisha to know that he had no such intention. His bowing was a matter of appropriate royal manners and had nothing to do with honoring a Syrian god. Elisha immediately understood. He told Naaman to go in peace. Naaman's actions would not count against him as being idolatrous. That's in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 5. That is a nice ending of the episode, except that the story does not end with this sweet moment. There is a sort of epilogue. In a way, the epilogue is almost as dramatic as the body of the story had been. Here's what happened. As Naaman headed back to Syria, when he had gone but a short distance, one of Elisha's servants spotted him on the way out of town. The servant's name was Gehazi, who was an apprentice in the prophetic guild, learning the ropes from his master. The narrator invites us into Gehazi's thought process at this point. He realized that Naaman had undergone this spectacular healing and, as a consequence, offered Elisha an incredibly expensive gift. Gehazi thought that it was foolish for Elisha to refuse the gift. What would have been wrong with receiving a thank offering from someone trying to show his gratitude? Gehazi might not be able to talk Naaman into giving the amount he had at first offered, but he might get something from the Syrian. To this end, he ran after Naaman. That's in verse 20. Once Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from his chariot to see whether something was wrong. That's in verse 21. Gehazi assured him that everything was just fine. Then Elisha's servant transitioned into a bold-faced lie. He noted that he had come at Elisha's behest. Just recently, he lied, 2 prophets had come to Elisha. Because of their request for funds, Elisha was wondering whether you might be willing to supply them with a talent of silver and 2 festal garments. Obviously, that was not near the amount that Naaman had initially offered, but a talent of silver and 2 festal garments would have translated into a sizable amount of money. Since Naaman had been so keen to give something for his healing, he was more than delighted with this request. At once, he arranged for 2 talents of silver, which required 2 bags, and the 2 festal garments to be given to Gehazi's servants, who now carried the loot to Gehazi. That's in verse 23. The Syrian had doubled the amount of silver that Gehazi had asked for. After this transaction, Naaman returned to his trip home. Simultaneously, Gehazi and his servants went back to their own territory too. When they came to, quote-unquote, the hill, Gehazi took the presents from his servants, put the silver and the garments in the house, and dismissed the servants. That's in verse 24. Gehazi had told what he regarded, apparently, as an innocent lie, made a little profit from what his master had accomplished, sent away the servants who had helped him, and figured he had covered his tracks. Then he went to see Elisha and stood before the great prophet. That's in verse 24. Elisha asked Gehazi an innocuous question. "Where have you been, Gehazi?" Gehazi's answer was priceless. "Your servant went nowhere." That's in verse 25. Anyone who has ever had children or been a child, which means everyone, knows how lame such an answer is. Nowhere means somewhere I should not have been. It's like the answer we give to a parent who asks what we are doing. Saying nothing means I have been doing something that I'm not allowed to do, or something really stupid that is going to get me into trouble. We all know this little game. When Gehazi says that he had not gone anywhere, we know that he is walking into a trap. Elisha immediately disabused Gehazi that he has gotten away with anything. Good grief! Gehazi is working for a prophet who somehow knew what was going on in the king's court. Did he think he could avoid prophetic detection? He couldn't and didn't. Elisha let the chagrined Gehazi know that he had been with him, quote-unquote, in spirit, at the very moment when Naaman dismounted his chariot. That's in verse 26. Elisha wanted Gehazi to explain why he figured this was the time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male and female servants. Obviously, none of those items were part of what Gehazi asked Naaman to provide. But all those items would have been possible to purchase had Naaman's initial offer been accepted. This is why Elisha refused the present. He wanted to underscore that God's gift is not for the highest bidder. Gehazi had not realized that, or he did realize it, but did not want to honor that principle. As it turns out, Elisha's question was rhetorical, and therefore did not need an answer. It was not time to accept a gift from Naaman, regardless of how lavish or modest it might have been. Naaman's healing was a matter of divine grace. Grace is never for sale. The episode does not conclude with Gehazi seeing the error of his way. His punishment was much more severe than a scolding from Elisha. Indeed, the punishment was dire. Gehazi would be afflicted with the same skin disease that had afflicted Naaman. Even worse, this skin condition would plague his own family forever. When Gehazi left Elisha's presence, he had already succumbed to this terrible skin condition. That's in verse 27. A story with an incredibly happy ending, just concluded with an incredibly tragic turn of events. There is one more terrible consequence to this judgment. This particular disease is not only serious for medical reasons. In addition, it makes one ritually unclean. There is no way to determine what diseases render someone as ritually unclean and what diseases do not, but this skin condition is the former. Though this seems not only strange, but even outrageous to our modern ears, being ritually unclean was part of the thought world in ancient times. The implications of being ritually unclean was that one was not permitted to enter the temple for worship. That is why two chapters in the book of Leviticus, chapters 13 and 14, are devoted to the diagnosis and treatment of this skin condition. Having this affliction would not keep one out of the temple forever. There were ways to deal with it so that one could worship the Lord in the temple. Of course, Naaman at first could not have cared less that the disease he had did not allow him to worship in an Israelite temple. For him initially, only his medical condition mattered. Once he was cured, the implications of having had the disease were now moot. He was no longer in Israel. He had Israelite dirt for his offerings to Israel's God, and, should the occasion ever arise, there was nothing that might prevent his entry into the temple. But Gehazi was a different matter. He was an Israelite, now afflicted with a disease that bars his entry into the temple. Regardless of its medical effects, the worst aspect of this skin condition was making one ritually unclean. To be sure, this could be overcome by applying the remedies listed in Leviticus. Nevertheless, from an Israelite point of view, Gehazi's being punished with his disease could not have been a worse fate. His greed had blinded him to the severity of what he had done in thinking that a cure such as Elisha offered could be purchased. A couple more observations are warranted as we reflect on this story. One has to do with how negatively Israelites are portrayed. Only the little girl who expressed such blithe faith in the prophet in Samaria and Elisha himself are portrayed positively. The Israelite king comes off as hapless and helpless. He anguishes over his plight, fails abjectly as a leader, and it never occurs to him that there is a prophet in Samaria. The little Israelite girl makes the king seem silly. Likewise, Elisha's own servant, Gehazi, and the servants who helped him in his scheme to exploit Naaman are also depicted negatively. They are craven in their scheme. Even Naaman's servants come off better than Elisha's. When Naaman stomped off in anger because Elisha had not bothered to come to the door, as we saw it last week, his servants reasoned with him to try the cure that the prophetic messenger had mentioned. Conversely, Elisha's servants, spearheaded by Gehazi, disgraced themselves by their greed and willingness to lie. One more feature is worth mentioning. Naaman, though he had acknowledged the Israelite deity as the only deity who existed, will still be a Syrian and live as a Syrian. He went back to Syria, assumed his duties before his king, and arranged to be in a Syrian temple to Rimmon without compromising his newfound Israelite faith. This is astonishing. In effect, Naaman could be an Israelite in terms of religious belief while remaining a Syrian in every other way, culturally, linguistically, socially, and so forth. Should we be surprised by that feature in this story? Perhaps. But let us not forget that Israel's deity is everyone else's deity as well. That is the nature of belief, that there is only one God. Should Naaman ever attribute any of his military victories to a god, there is only one God that could be responsible, namely Israel's God. As it turns out, that is exactly what we are told at the very beginning of the story, namely that Naaman's victories were attributable to Israel's God. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is so that I can get a hold of you when we are ready for our mini courses. Also, if you have questions that you would like me to address in a Q and answer session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.